The scratching came from under the cabin again, and this time, the German shepherd did not bark. He just stood over the old pine floor with his ears high, his amber eyes fixed on one narrow seam between the boards, as if something beneath the house had whispered his name. Staff Sergeant Caleb Walker woke before the sound fully reached him. Years of service had taught his body to rise before his mind understood why, to listen before moving, to breathe quietly in the dark until the room gave up its secrets. For 3 still seconds, he lay on the narrow bed in the loft, one hand already closed around the small flashlight on the crate beside him. The cabin was black except for a thin bar of moonlight leaking through the frost-edged window. Outside, the Montana woods held their breath. No wind, no branch tapping the roof, no owl calling from the pines. Only that sound. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Light, careful, almost polite. Like the tip of a small tool dragging against wood from the wrong side of the floor. Caleb sat up slowly. The old mattress gave a soft complaint beneath him. Down below, Atlas did not move. The German shepherd stood in the center of the room, shadowed by the cold glow from the stove, his sable coat dark along the spine, his chest still, his tail lowered but not tucked. He was not afraid. That troubled Caleb more than fear would have. Atlas feared almost nothing, but he respected danger. He respected hidden things. He had once found a missing child in a drainage culvert after 20 volunteers had walked past the same road twice. He had once refused to enter a storage shed until Caleb opened the side door and found a nest of yellow jackets inside the wall. Atlas did not waste worry. If he stared, there was a reason. If he waited, something was coming. Caleb swung his feet onto the ladder and climbed down without turning on the overhead light. The cabin air was cold enough to tighten his lungs. It smelled of dead ashes, old timber, wet wool, and the faint pine soap he had used on the floor that afternoon. Beneath all of it, there was something else now, something thin and sour, not rotten exactly, but sealed away too long. Dust, damp earth, old cloth. Atlas glanced at him once, then looked back at the floor. Caleb whispered, "Easy, boy." The dog did not blink. The scratching stopped. That was the first thing that made Caleb's throat go dry. Not the sound itself. The silence after. It had the shape of listening. Caleb crossed the room in his socks, each step finding a familiar creak in the boards. The cabin was small, one main room, a sleeping loft, a narrow kitchen, a stone fireplace, and a back door that stuck when the weather changed. He had bought it 3 weeks earlier from a property office in Pine Hollow, a town so small the diner still wrote daily specials in chalk, and the sheriff knew every truck by its headlights. The listing had called the place rustic. The banker had called it a bargain. Earl Whitcomb, the local man who handled the sale, had called it a chance for peace. Caleb had heard other words beneath those. Remote. Unwanted. Cheap for a reason. Still, he bought it. Not because he loved cabins. Not because he knew how to fix roofs or split firewood well enough to last a Montana winter. He bought it because it sat 6 miles from the nearest paved road, tucked behind a ridge where cell service gave up and strangers rarely came by mistake. After years of commands, radio chatter, hospital hallways, and people asking how he was doing with eyes that already feared the answer, Caleb wanted a place where silence did not expect him to explain himself. The cabin offered that. Or it had, until the first night. He crouched beside Atlas and held the flashlight low, thumb resting on the switch. The dog leaned forward until his black nose nearly touched the seam in the floor. His nostrils trembled. His ears twitched once. Caleb could hear the stove settling, the roof ticking in the cold, his own pulse steady but hard. He clicked the light on. The beam was small and yellow, crossing the boards and revealing what daylight had missed. Scratches. Not many, not fresh enough to shine, but there. Thin pale lines around a plank near the center of the room, half hidden by the edge of a faded braided rug. Caleb moved the rug aside. Atlas lowered his head, then placed one paw gently on the marked board. Not scratching. Pointing. Caleb swallowed. What is it? The words sounded too loud in the cabin. Atlas answered with silence. That was his way. Caleb had adopted him from AK-9 rescue outside Billings after the dog had been retired from search work due to a hip strain that never quite slowed him down, only made him more deliberate. The first time Caleb met him, Atlas had not jumped, licked, or begged. He had walked straight over, pressed his head once against Caleb's knee, then sat facing the door, as if saying they could leave when Caleb was ready. No performance, no demand, just presence. That had been enough. Caleb had spent most of his adult life surrounded by men who could read a room without a word, men who knew when silence meant calm and when it meant take cover. Atlas had that same old-soul watchfulness. He was 5 years old, deep sable with a black saddle and a gray brush beginning at his muzzle, though the vet said he was too young to look so wise. Caleb did not think wisdom cared much about age. Sometimes it arrived early and stayed heavy. The scratching had begun on their second night in the cabin. At first, Caleb blamed the house. Old wood spoke in winter. Pipes clicked. Squirrels found places they did not belong. He had spent 2 mornings checking the crawl space, tapping foundation stones, shining a light through gaps beneath the porch. He found mouse droppings, a dry nest of leaves, a rusted paint can, and 1 cracked mason jar. Nothing large enough to make Atlas stand guard for hours. Nothing that explained the timing. Always 2:17 a.m. Caleb noticed it on the 4th night, when he looked at the battery clock above the stove and felt a small unease gather behind his ribs. 2:17, the next night too. Then again. Same minute. Same seam in the floor. Same dog, rigid as a statue, waiting like a sentry at a gate no one else could see. He told himself not to make meaning from coincidence. Men alone in the woods did that. They put faces in knots of wood, voices in wind, warnings in the shift of shadows. Caleb knew the mind could build an enemy out of emptiness if you gave it enough quiet. Still, he had not slept well since. He had begun leaving his boots beside the bed facing the ladder. He had begun keeping the flashlight close. He had begun watching Atlas more than the windows. Tonight was colder than the others. The thermometer nailed outside the kitchen window had dropped to 21 degrees before midnight. Frost feathered the glass from the corners inward. In the fireplace, the last coals slept under a gray crust. Caleb's breath showed faintly when he leaned closer to the floor. He pressed his ear to the board. Atlas shifted, not away, but nearer, his shoulder touching Caleb's arm. Warmth through fur. A living anchor. Caleb listened. At first, nothing. Then a sound so small he almost missed it. Not scratching now. A faint drag, like fabric moving over dirt. Then 1 soft tap from below. Caleb lifted his head. Atlas's eyes met his. The dog knew he had heard it. The room seemed to narrow. Caleb ran a hand along the board, feeling for looseness. The wood was old, but the nails held firm. He followed the scratches with his fingertips. They circled 1 plank, then stopped near a darker spot where the grain had been patched years ago with wax or old varnish. He scraped at it lightly with his thumbnail. A crumb came loose. Beneath it, the head of a nail showed, not rusty like the others, but newer, dulled by dust. Someone had taken this board up once and put it back down. Not a century ago. Not when the cabin was built. More recently. Caleb sat back on his heels. Well, he murmured, that is not a mouse. Atlas gave a low breath through his nose. Not a growl. Agreement. Caleb stood and crossed to the kitchen drawer. He found a flathead screwdriver, a claw hammer, and the small folding knife he used for feed sacks and twine. He paused with his hand on the drawer pull, listening again. The sound beneath the floor had stopped. Outside, the forest remained still. The cabin felt awake around him. He returned to the marked board, set the flashlight on its side, and began working the screwdriver beneath the nail head. The metal slipped twice. The 3rd time, it caught. The nail rose with a soft squeak that sounded too much like a warning in the quiet room. Atlas backed 1 step, then sat, eyes locked on Caleb's hands. Caleb worked slowly. No drama. No rush. He had learned long ago that panic made poor tools of good hands. 1 nail. Then another. The board lifted a fraction of an inch. Cold air breathed up through the gap, carrying that same sealed smell, stronger now. Damp soil. Old cloth. Something animal, but not wild. Atlas stood again. His ears came forward. Caleb lifted the board just enough to shine the flashlight through. The beam struck packed earth maybe 18 inches below, a cross support beam, and a scatter of old insulation pulled loose like dirty cotton. Nothing moved. He angled the light farther. A shadow caught. Caleb frowned and shifted the beam. There, wedged against the support, was a strip of cloth. Pale blue, faded nearly gray. Too clean-edged to be part of the insulation. He reached down carefully, 2 fingers extended, and pinched it free. It resisted for a second, snagged on a splinter, then came loose. Caleb brought it into the light. A small piece of fabric, maybe from a child's blanket or a shirt, with a faded pattern of tiny white stars. Dust clung to it. So did several strands of tan and black fur. Atlas leaned in and sniffed. The moment the scent reached him, his whole body changed. Not fear. Recognition, though Caleb had no idea of what. The dog stepped back, turned toward the fireplace, then returned to the board and pawed once at the floor beside it. Caleb stared at the scrap in his hand. It was nothing and too much at the same time. A piece of cloth under an old cabin floor could mean anything. A child had dropped it years ago. A raccoon had dragged it from a campsite. A previous owner had stored rags below. But the fur, the timing, the scratches. Atlas's eyes. Caleb folded the cloth and set it on the table. His chest felt tight in the way it did before weather changed. He could open more boards. He could crawl beneath the cabin at first light. He could call someone. But who? The sheriff would ask whether Caleb had seen anyone. No. Whether someone was trapped. No proof. Whether he had been sleeping. Not much. Whether he was sure the sound was not an animal. Caleb looked at Atlas. I am sure you are sure, he said softly. The dog kept watching the floor. Caleb did not sleep again. By dawn, the world outside had gone blue and silver. The pines stood dark and tall against a pale sky, their branches carrying a powder of frost. Smoke from the chimney rose straight up, thin and obedient. Caleb made coffee on the stove and drank it black, while Atlas lay near the table with his head on his paws, eyes open. The cabin looked harmless in morning light. That irritated Caleb. Night had a way of telling the truth, and daylight had a way of making you apologize for believing it. He put on jeans, a thermal shirt, his field jacket, and work boots. He took the cloth scrap, sealed it in a sandwich bag, and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat. Then he went outside with Atlas to inspect the foundation again. The cold struck clean and sharp. Snow from 2 days earlier crusted beneath his boots. The cabin sat on a stone-imposed foundation, high enough in places for a man to crawl beneath, too low in others for comfort. Caleb crouched near the eastern side where the ground sloped down. Atlas moved beside him, nose working. Under the house, darkness pooled between beams and old pipes. Caleb clicked on the flashlight. He saw the same things he had seen before: stones, dirt, spiderwebs, scraps of lumber, a broken shovel handle, wind-blown leaves gathered like small brown hands. But now he knew where to look. He counted steps from the kitchen window, measured the distance to the stove pipe, and found the approximate spot beneath the marked floorboard. The earth there looked different. Smoother. Pressed down. Not recently disturbed, but not natural either. A shallow depression ran toward the center of the cabin, disappearing under a low crossbeam and a sheet of old tin nailed across part of the foundation. Caleb reached toward the tin. Atlas gave one quiet whine. Caleb stopped. The dog's eyes were not on the tin. They were on the tree line beyond the cabin. Caleb turned slowly. Nothing moved between the pines. The morning was bright enough to see the fence posts, the old woodpile, the narrow track leading down toward the county road. Still, Atlas watched the woods with the kind of attention he reserved for approaching footsteps. Caleb stood. Far off, beyond the ridge, an engine murmured. Not close. Not yet. Sound traveled strangely in the cold. Caleb waited until it faded. A truck on the county road, maybe. A hunter. A rancher. Earl Whitcomb had mentioned neighbors, though the nearest occupied place was 2 miles away and hidden by timber. Caleb looked back at the cabin. Come on, he told Atlas. We are going into town. Atlas did not want to leave. That was clear from the way he paused at the porch and looked back at the floor inside, then at Caleb, then back again. Caleb understood the feeling. Leaving an unanswered question alone in a house felt like leaving a candle near dry curtains. But there were things a man should not solve with only a hammer and a tired mind. Pine Hollow sat 30 minutes away when the road was dry and 45 when the ruts froze hard. Caleb's old white Ford pickup complained the whole way down the mountain. Atlas rode in the passenger seat, upright and silent, his nose occasionally lifting toward the cracked window. The road curled through lodgepole pine and open meadows glazed with frost. A herd of mule deer watched them pass from a hill. The sky spread pale and wide above the mountains, with clouds gathering in the west like folded wool. Caleb drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the bagged cloth in his pocket. He told himself he was going to ask a simple question. That was all. Maybe the vet would identify the fur. Maybe she would say coyote. Maybe she would say old shepherd, old blanket, old cabin, nothing more. Maybe that would be enough to steady the room inside his head. But as they descended toward town, another memory rose without permission. A different room. A different kind of waiting. A radio gone quiet. A promise he had made to come back with everyone. He pushed the memory away before it became sound. Atlas turned his head and watched him. Caleb gave a tired half-smile. Do not start. The dog blinked once. Pine Hollow appeared between two ridges, a scatter of brick storefronts, white church steeple, hardware store, feed shop, diner, gas station, and a little animal clinic with a green metal roof near the creek. A bell above the clinic door chimed when Caleb entered. Warm air met him, carrying the clean smell of antiseptic, cedar shavings, and coffee. Somewhere in the back, a small dog gave 2 cheerful barks, then quieted. Behind the counter, a woman looked up from a stack of forms. Grace Miller was in her early 30s, with fair skin touched by the cold, brown hair pulled back in a practical knot, and eyes that had the steady patience of someone who had learned to calm frightened animals before calming people. She wore a navy clinic jacket over a gray sweater, and there was a small smear of flower-colored powder on one sleeve, probably from medication or feed. She had examined Atlas the week Caleb moved in, pressing gentle fingers along the dog's hips, smiling when Atlas tolerated her with solemn dignity. Caleb remembered her saying, "He has opinions." Caleb had answered, "He has standards." Grace smiled now when she saw the dog. "Atlas, my most serious patient." Atlas walked to the counter and sat. Grace looked at Caleb. "Morning, Sergeant Walker." "Caleb is fine." "Then Grace is fine." She came around the counter and crouched to greet Atlas, offering the back of her hand. Atlas sniffed, accepted one stroke between the ears, then looked toward Caleb's pocket. Grace noticed. "That is new." Caleb took out the sandwich bag and set it on the counter. Inside, the pale blue cloth looked smaller than it had in the dark. Less important. Almost foolish. He suddenly felt aware of the fluorescent lights, the cheerful bulletin board, the jar of dog treats shaped like bones. "I found this." Grace did not speak at first. She only knelt beside Caleb, close enough for her sleeve to brush the cold floor, and listened as the soft sound faded beneath the boards. The cabin seemed to hold the last note of it in the walls. Snow tapped the windows. The loose fireplace stone sat crooked in the corner of Caleb's vision, like a mouth that had almost opened. Atlas lowered his nose to the seam and inhaled slowly, then moved from the center of the room to the hearth, tracing an invisible path between the two places. Caleb watched him the way a man watches a compass when the sky has gone dark. "It is not coming from directly below us," Grace whispered. Caleb nodded. "It is traveling." He took the hammer and screwdriver from the table, but his hand stayed calm. That steadiness came from old discipline, the kind that did not disappear when the uniform came off. He worked the first board loose again, then the second, careful not to split the pine. Each nail rose with a tired squeal. Cold air lifted from below, carrying damp earth and the dry scent of old paper. Grace aimed her headlamp into the opening. The beam reached dirt, support beams, torn insulation, then disappeared into a narrow black space running toward the fireplace foundation. "There is a channel," she said. "Maybe an old utility crawl." Caleb lay flat and reached down with the flashlight. His shoulder pressed against the floor. Dust clung to his sleeve. Atlas stood over him, silent and watchful. The light found something pale wedged beneath the crossbeam. Not bone, not anything terrible. A small wooden block, painted yellow once, with one faded letter on its side. Caleb hooked it with the screwdriver and dragged it close enough to lift. Grace took it in her gloved hand. The letter was E. A child's toy. Her face changed in a quiet way, not shock, not fear, but grief arriving politely. "Emily," she said. Caleb looked toward the photograph still tucked in Grace's bag, the little girl beside Mercy, both of them frozen in a happier year. The cabin suddenly felt less like a structure and more like a memory with walls. Atlas turned toward the hearth and gave one low whine. Caleb stood. "The sound is behind there." Grace rose with him. "Then someone wanted that stone moved today." The words settled between them. Earl had been here. Maybe he had come for whatever was hidden. Maybe the scratching had started because something shifted when he tried to reach it. Caleb crouched at the fireplace and pressed both hands against the loose stone. It moved half an inch, then stuck. He tried again, slower. Mortar dust fell in thin gray lines. Behind the stone was not solid masonry, but a dark gap. Grace brought the lamp closer. Atlas stepped forward, then stopped, his body tense but controlled. From somewhere inside the wall came the faintest sound yet. A breath. Not human. Small. Living. Caleb felt the room tilt into purpose. Grace. I hear it. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shone. Caleb used the screwdriver to clear the cracked mortar. The stone shifted free at last, heavy in his hands. He set it down gently on the hearth. Behind it lay an opening no wider than a boot box, lined with old timber and packed dust. A thin draft slipped through, warmer than the cabin air, carrying the unmistakable scent of dog fur. Atlas pressed his nose near the gap and suddenly wagged his tail once, hard and hopeful. Grace reached into her medical kit, pulling out a soft towel. If there is an animal in there, we go slow. Caleb nodded. He widened the opening board by board, never forcing more than the old wood would allow. The cabin answered with creaks, but it held. Snow thickened outside, softening the forest into white silence. At last, the gap opened enough for the light to enter. The beam reached a narrow hollow behind the hearth, then a sloping passage dropping under the cabin. And there, half hidden in a nest of shredded cloth and cedar chips, 2 amber eyes reflected back. Tiny, frightened, alive. Grace covered her mouth with one gloved hand. Atlas lay down flat, making himself small, and gave a sound Caleb had never heard from him before, a gentle rumble like comfort. The little German shepherd puppy did not come forward. It trembled in the light, sable fur dusty, paws tucked beneath its chest, one ear folded over like it had not yet learned the weight of the world. Caleb did not reach for it. He only lowered his voice until it was almost part of the fireless hearth. Hey there. Nobody is going to rush you. The puppy blinked. Grace unfolded the towel and placed it near the opening. Warmth first. Trust second. Caleb glanced at Atlas. The old dog did not move. He simply breathed slowly into the dark, as if teaching the little one how to believe the room above was safe. The puppy did not trust the light. It stared from the hollow behind the hearth with eyes too large for its dusty face, breathing in small, uneven pulls while the snow whispered against the cabin windows. Caleb stayed on one knee, one hand resting on Atlas's shoulder, the other open on the floor where the puppy could see it. He knew better than to grab at fear. Fear had teeth, even when it was small. Grace moved with the kind of patience that made the room feel safer. She warmed the towel near the stove, not too close, then placed a shallow dish of water just inside the opening. The puppy's nose twitched. Atlas remained flat on the floor, chin down, ears soft, a king lowering himself before a frightened child. Minutes passed. Then the puppy crawled forward 1 inch. Then another. Its front paws touched the towel, and the whole cabin seemed to hold still. That is it, Grace murmured. Easy. Caleb did not breathe until the puppy stepped fully into the room. It was a German shepherd, maybe 9 weeks old, underweight but alert, with sable fur dulled by dust, and a faint white mark shaped like a tear beneath its chin. Grace wrapped it gently, checked its gums, listened to its chest, and let out a careful breath. Cold, hungry, dehydrated, but stable. Caleb looked at the little dog trembling in her arms. How did it survive down there? Grace's eyes moved to the gap behind the hearth. There may be another way in. Some kind of old passage. Small animals could get through. Maybe it found water from melting snow or a drip line. Atlas stood suddenly and looked back into the opening. Not at the puppy. Beyond it. Grace followed his gaze. Caleb lifted the flashlight again. Deeper in the hollow, behind the shredded cloth nest, something reflected the beam. Metal. Caleb reached in slowly and pulled out a rusted collar. The leather was stiff, the buckle green with age, but the tag still hung from the ring. He wiped it with his thumb. Purple paint clung to the carved letters. Mercy. Around the name, tiny white stars. Grace closed her eyes for a second. She was here. Caleb held the collar like it had weight far beyond leather and metal. The old dog from the photograph was not a rumor anymore. Not town gossip. Not a sad story people had learned to step around. She had been here, beneath this house, close enough to hear footsteps above her, close enough to scratch until someone should have listened. Atlas sniffed the collar, then lowered his head. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, a quiet ache shaped like respect. She protected something, he said. Grace nodded toward the dark passage. Or someone. Caleb set the collar on the table beside the child's block and the blue cloth, each object small, each one pulling the past closer. The puppy whimpered softly from Grace's arms. Atlas moved near and touched its head with his nose. The little one leaned into him, as if it recognized a language older than names. Then Caleb heard it. Not scratching this time. A hollow thud beneath the hearth, faint but distinct, as if a loose board had shifted somewhere below. He and Grace looked at each other. Atlas was already moving. He returned to the fireplace opening, put one paw against the lower timber, and pushed. It gave slightly. Caleb crouched and found a narrow panel hidden behind packed dirt and old cedar strips. He worked it loose with the screwdriver. Behind it was a small oilcloth bundle, dry despite the years, tied with brittle cord. Grace held the puppy closer. Caleb. Her voice was barely above the stove's soft tick. He untied the bundle carefully. Inside were papers, photographs, and a folded map of the property marked in blue ink. There were boundary lines, signatures, and a handwritten note pressed between two deeds. Caleb did not read it aloud at first. His eyes moved over the words once, then again, slower. Grace stepped beside him. The note was from Daniel Harper. It said the land was being taken from them through forged claims, that he had hidden the true documents where only Mercy would stay, because no one could make that dog abandon the house. It ended with one line that made Grace turn away toward the window. If we do not come back by morning, please believe the dog. Caleb looked at Atlas, then at the rescued puppy wrapped in Grace's towel, then at the floor that had spent years trying to speak. Outside, an engine sound rose faintly through the snowfall, climbing the road toward the cabin. The engine climbed the ridge slowly, its sound muffled by falling snow, but Atlas heard it before the headlights touched the trees. His body changed in one breath. The softness he had shown the puppy disappeared into stillness. He stepped between the front door and the table where Caleb had laid the collar, the child's block, the blue cloth, and the oilcloth bundle of papers. Grace drew the towel-wrapped puppy closer to her chest, one hand steady beneath its ribs, the other already reaching for her phone. There was no signal. The little screen showed nothing but one empty bar that vanished when she turned toward the window. Caleb folded the documents with care, slid them back into the oilcloth, and tucked the bundle inside his jacket. He did not hurry. Hurry gave fear too much room. The truck stopped outside. A door opened. Boots touched the porch with a measured weight. Earl Wickham did not knock right away. He stood beyond the door as if listening to the cabin listen back. Then came 3 polite taps. Sergeant Walker, Earl called, his voice warm enough to fool a stranger. Road is getting rough. Thought I would check in. Caleb looked at Grace. She held his gaze, then stepped back toward the kitchen, keeping the puppy shielded from the draft. Atlas remained in the center of the room, head low, eyes fixed on the door. Caleb opened it only halfway. Earl stood on the porch under a dusting of snow, his tan hat darkened at the brim, his smile small and practiced. Behind him, his black pickup idled with its lights on, casting pale beams through the storm. That is neighborly, Caleb said. Earl glanced past him into the room. His eyes paused on the lifted floorboards, the open hearth, the dust on Caleb's sleeves. Looks like you have been busy. Old houses have questions. Some questions cost more than they are worth. Earl's smile thinned. I told you the foundation was touchy. Atlas gave a low warning from inside. Earl's gaze dropped toward the dog, then lifted again. You mind if I come in out of the snow? Caleb did not move. I do. The silence after that was clean and sharp. Earl's face stayed pleasant, but his eyes hardened like water freezing under thin ice. I handled that property in good faith. Did you? You bought a cabin, not a museum, not a family archive. Grace stepped into view then, calm but pale, the puppy wrapped safely against her coat. Earl saw the small sable head, and for the first time, surprise broke through. Not much, just enough. Where did that come from? He asked. Grace answered before Caleb could. From the place someone wanted forgotten. Earl looked at the hearth opening. The snow whispered behind him. The truck engine hummed. You should be careful making stories out of old junk and stray animals. Caleb's voice stayed low. There are documents. Earl's jaw tightened. Documents can be misunderstood. So can silence. Atlas moved one step forward. Not attacking. Not lunging. just standing with the certainty of a locked gate. Earl looked at the dog, and the cabin seemed to remember another German shepherd, another winter, another person at the door who had not believed an animal could keep a promise longer than men could keep a lie. Grace shifted slightly, enough for Caleb to see she had found a signal near the kitchen window. Her thumb moved across the phone screen. Earl noticed too late. His polite mask returned in a hurry. No need to involve anyone. We can talk this through. We are done talking through closed doors, Caleb said. Far down the road, faint at first, then clearer, another engine sounded through the snowfall. Earl turned his head. Red and blue lights did not flash yet, but the low shape of Sheriff Nolan's cruiser appeared between the pines, climbing steadily toward the cabin. Earl took one step back from the threshold. Atlas took one step forward. The old floor creaked beneath the dog's paws, not like a warning now, but like an answer finally spoken aloud. Sheriff Nolan's cruiser rolled into the clearing with its headlights cutting through the snowfall, slow and steady, the way a man drives when he already knows trouble is waiting but refuses to let trouble set the pace. Earl Whitcomb stood on Caleb's porch with snow gathering on his shoulders, one hand half raised as if he still hoped to look innocent by posture alone. Caleb stayed in the doorway. Atlas stayed beside him. Grace stood near the kitchen window with the puppy wrapped against her coat, its tiny head tucked beneath her chin, breathing softer now in the warmth of the room. Sheriff Nolan stepped out wearing a brown county jacket over his uniform, his gray mustache dusted white, his eyes moving once from Earl to Caleb to the open floorboards behind them. He did not reach for drama. Pine Hollow had no use for dramatic men. Grace called, he said there were old property documents and an animal found under the structure. Earl gave a light laugh that died too quickly. Sheriff, this is a misunderstanding. Sergeant Walker is new to the area. Old cabins make folks imagine things. Nolan looked at the German shepherd puppy in Grace's arms. That puppy looks real enough. Caleb stepped aside and let the sheriff enter. Earl hesitated, then followed only after Nolan glanced back at him. Inside, the cabin seemed smaller with 4 adults, 2 dogs, and 12 years of silence pressing against the walls. Caleb placed the oilcloth bundle on the table and unfolded it carefully. The deed papers were brittle but readable. The map showed the original Harper boundary lines reaching far beyond the current fence posts. The handwritten note lay on top, its ink faded brown, the last sentence quiet and terrible in its simplicity. Please believe the dog. Nolan read it once without expression. Then he read it again. Grace set Mercy's rusted collar beside the note. The purple letters caught the low light from the window. Earl stopped pretending to smile. Old paper does not prove intent, he said. No one said intent, Caleb answered. You did. The sheriff looked at Earl then, and the room shifted. Not loud, not sudden, just enough for the truth to know it had been invited in. Nolan asked for Earl's keys, not with anger, but with county authority and a voice that had settled bar fights, land disputes, and grief-struck families for 30 years. Earl resisted with words first, then with silence, then finally placed the keys on the table. No one touched him. No one needed to. His own face did the unraveling. Nolan opened Earl's truck while Caleb and Grace waited on the porch beneath the soft curtain of snow. Atlas stood at the top step, watching the sheriff search through a locked document case behind the truck seat. Inside were survey copies, old transfer forms, and a photograph of the Harper cabin with new boundary marks drawn in red. Nolan sealed everything in evidence bags from his cruiser. Earl looked smaller now, not because anyone had harmed him, but because hidden things shrink when daylight reaches them. As Nolan guided him toward the cruiser for questioning, Earl turned once toward the cabin, his eyes settling on Atlas. The dog did not growl. He only watched. That was worse. It was the gaze of every loyal creature Earl had underestimated, every quiet witness he thought could not speak. When the cruiser finally disappeared down the road, the clearing fell still again. Snow covered the tire tracks almost immediately, as if the mountain itself wanted the old ugliness gone. Inside the cabin, Grace examined the puppy more fully near the stove. Male, she said softly. Young enough to recover fast if he keeps eating. Old enough to have been surviving on instinct. Caleb warmed a small bowl of water and set it near the towel. Atlas lay beside the puppy, close but careful, letting the little one press against his front leg. The old collar rested on the table near the child's block. Caleb picked it up and turned it in his hands. Mercy had not lived to see the door open. But somehow, through years, through wood, through weather, through one last descendant curled in the dark, she had still led them here. Grace looked at Caleb across the stove glow. "What will you name him?" Caleb watched the puppy lean into Atlas and close its eyes for the first peaceful second of its small life. "Hope," he said, and for the first time since he bought the cabin, the word did not sound too fragile to survive the night. By morning, the storm had moved east and left the ridge washed clean beneath a pale Montana sky. Sunlight touched the cabin slowly, first along the porch rail, then across the frosted windows, then over the old floorboards that no longer seemed to hide a secret with every creak. Caleb had not slept much, but the tiredness in him was different now. It did not feel like defeat. It felt like keeping watch until the wounded thing in the room remembered how to rest. Hope slept in a small crate Grace had lined with warm towels beside the stove, his round belly rising and falling after broth, water, and the first safe meal he had probably ever known. Atlas lay close enough for the puppy to smell him, but not so close that his size would frighten him. Every few minutes, Hope twitched in his sleep, and Atlas lifted his head, checked him, then settled again with the grave patience of an old guardian. Grace returned from town just after 9 with medicine, soft food, and a cardboard file box from her father's clinic records. Snow squeaked beneath her boots as she came up the steps. Caleb opened the door before she knocked. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The cabin smelled of coffee, cedar, warm towels, and the faint mineral scent of old stone. It no longer smelled sealed. Grace looked toward the hearth, where the hidden opening had been cleaned and braced with temporary boards. "He made it through the night?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "Atlas did most of the work." Grace smiled softly. "That sounds like Atlas." She examined Hope near the stove, gentle hands, quiet voice, no rush. The puppy blinked at her, then sneezed so fiercely he startled himself. Caleb felt a laugh rise before he could stop it. Small, rusty, real. Grace looked up, and her smile deepened without teasing him for it. Outside, Sheriff Nolan arrived later with 2 deputies and a county surveyor. They worked carefully around the cabin, documenting the old crawl space, the hidden passage, the papers, the changed boundary markers beyond the pines. No one treated Mercy's collar like evidence only. Nolan removed his hat when Caleb placed it on the table beside the child's block. Even the younger deputy went quiet. Some things asked for respect without ever raising their voice. By afternoon, the truth had a shape. The Harper land had been tangled in false filings for years, but the original documents were strong enough to reopen everything. Daniel Harper's note, Grace's clinic record, the collar, the map, and Earl's locked case would speak where rumor never could. The county would handle the law. Caleb understood that. What mattered to him was simpler. A forgotten promise had reached the surface. A dog no one had believed had finally been believed. As the sun began to sink, Grace helped Caleb repair the opening beneath the hearth, not to bury it again, but to make it safe. Before the last board went in, Caleb wrapped Mercy's collar in clean cloth and placed it inside a small wooden box with the blue fabric scrap and Emily's yellow block. He set the box in a dry space beneath the porch, where the morning light would reach through the slats. Grace stood beside him, holding Hope inside her jacket while Atlas watched from the steps. Caleb rested his hand on the box for a moment. He did not make a speech. He had learned that the deepest thanks often came without language. "You were right," he said quietly. The wind moved through the pines like a long breath. Atlas stepped down, touched his nose once to Caleb's wrist, then turned back toward Hope. Weeks passed. The cabin changed in small ways. New boards replaced the warped ones. The hearth was cleaned. A proper dog bed appeared near the stove, though Hope preferred sleeping against Atlas whenever the old shepherd allowed it. Grace came by often at first for checkups, then for coffee, then sometimes just to sit on the porch while the ridge turned gold in the evening. Caleb still woke at night now and then, listening before he knew why. But the scratching never returned. At 2:17 one clear morning, he opened his eyes to silence and saw Atlas asleep by the door, Hope curled against his chest like a comma at the end of a long sentence. Moonlight rested on the floor where the sound had once begun. Caleb lay still and let the quiet remain quiet. Some houses are not haunted by ghosts. Some are haunted by the mercy no one answered in time. And sometimes, When the right soul finally listens, even an old cabin can stop grieving. By spring, wildflowers pushed through the thaw around the porch. Hope grew into his paws, clumsy and bright, carrying sticks too large for him and following Atlas through the meadow as if learning a sacred trait. Caleb stood at the fence one morning while Grace checked the puppy's collar, a new blue one with a small silver tag. Hope, Atlas sat between them, facing the trees, calm as a prayer that had already been heard. The cabin behind them glowed in the sun, no longer a place to disappear, but a place where lost things had been found, where silence had been trusted, and where one Marine learned that coming home was not always the end of a mission. Sometimes it was where the real rescue began. The first Sunday after the thaw, Pine Hollow held its spring market on Main Street, and Caleb drove down from the ridge with both dogs in the truck, though he told himself he was only going because Grace needed help carrying clinic supplies. Atlas sat in the passenger seat like a quiet officer inspecting the town, while Hope bounced in the back seat, nose smudging the window, tail thumping against the old vinyl with every passing fence post. The road was no longer white and silent. It had softened into mud at the edges, with grass showing bright under the last patches of snow. Creeks ran loud beneath the culverts. The air smelled of wet pine, warm soil, and the first brave flowers opening along the ditch. Caleb kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on the mirror, watching Hope discover the world in flashes: a mailbox, a crow, a tractor, a school bus parked beside the church. Every small thing amazed him. That did something to Caleb. It reminded him that survival was not the same as living. Survival kept the heart beating. Living taught it to look out the window. Main Street was already full when they arrived. White tents lined the sidewalks. Kids ran with paper bags of kettle corn. Farmers unloaded jars of honey, seed packets, quilts, and hand-carved signs. A fiddle played somewhere near the diner, bright and uneven. Caleb had spent years moving through crowds by scanning hands, exits, reflections in glass. He still did it now, but the habit felt less sharp with Hope trotting beside him and Atlas steady at his left knee. People noticed the dogs first. Then they noticed Caleb. Not with pity this time. With recognition. The quiet kind of town gives when it has decided you belong to the story now. Grace waved from the clinic tent, her brown hair loose beneath a blue cap, sleeves rolled to her elbows as she arranged vaccination forms and little bags of puppy food. When Hope saw her, he nearly tripped over his own paws trying to reach her. Grace laughed and crouched just in time for him to climb into her arms, as if he had been gone for years instead of 15 minutes. Atlas watched with solemn approval. "He has gained 3 pounds, Grace said, "and possibly 10 pounds of confidence." Caleb looked down at the puppy licking Grace's chin. "That confidence is your fault. I accept responsibility." The words were light, but something quiet moved beneath them. Caleb felt it and let it be. Nearby, Sheriff Nolan stood beside a folding table with county maps spread beneath paperweights. He nodded Caleb over. The legal work was not finished, but the first rulings had come through. The forged filings were being reversed. The Harper boundary was being restored. Some of the land would become protected community woodland, with a small trail named for the family. Nolan said it plainly, without ceremony, but Caleb heard the grace inside it. Land that had been taken in silence would now hold footsteps, birdsong, children's laughter, and dogs running under open sky. Later that afternoon, Grace brought Caleb a small envelope. Inside was a copy of the old clinic photograph, Mercy sitting tall beside Emily Harper, the purple star tag bright against her chest. Caleb stared at it for a long time. Hope sat at his boot, chewing a fallen maple twig. Atlas stood beside him, looking at the photograph as if memory could pass through paper. Caleb did not know whether dogs understood pictures. He only knew Atlas leaned forward once and touched his nose to Mercy's image with impossible gentleness. The market noise softened around them. For a moment, Caleb was back in the cabin, hearing the scratch beneath the floor, feeling the old house ask to be believed. Then Hope barked at a butterfly, and the world returned laughing. By sunset, they drove home with a box of supplies, 2 loaves of bread from the church ladies, and a blue ribbon someone had tied loosely to Hope's collar after declaring him the unofficial miracle of Pine Hollow. Caleb pretended the attention embarrassed him, but Grace saw him adjust the ribbon so it would not bother the puppy's neck. The cabin waited on the ridge in amber evening light. Atlas jumped down first, then Hope, who chased his own shadow across the yard before tumbling into the grass. Caleb stood by the truck and listened. No scratching, no hidden plea, only wind in the pines, Grace closing the clinic box, Hope sneezing in the clover, Atlas breathing beside him. The quiet had changed. It was no longer empty. It was full of everything that had been saved. Summer came gently to the ridge, not all at once, but in small mercies. The creek behind the cabin loosened into clear song. The meadow filled with yellow balsam root and purple lupin. Mornings smelled of sun-warmed pine needles, coffee, and the clean dust of sawed lumber as Caleb repaired the last weathered parts of the porch. Hope grew faster than anyone expected. His ears finally stood upright, though one still tilted whenever he was curious, which was almost always. He followed Atlas everywhere, copying the old dog with comic seriousness, sitting when Atlas sat, lifting his nose when Atlas smelled the wind, staring into the trees as if he too carried ancient responsibility in his puppy bones. Atlas tolerated him with quiet dignity. Sometimes, when Hope became too bold and tried to steal the larger dog's blanket, Atlas would simply place one paw on the edge and look at him until the puppy remembered humility. Caleb saw himself in that patient correction more than once. He had spent years believing strength meant holding every burden alone. Atlas seemed to know better. Strength, the dog taught without words, was knowing what to guard, what to release, and when to let a clumsy young soul sleep beside you. Grace's visits became part of the cabin's rhythm. She came with medicine at first, then with groceries, then with no official reason at all except that the evenings were long and the porch faced the best part of the sunset. They would sit in two old chairs Caleb had sanded smooth, drinking sweet tea from mason jars while the dogs wandered the meadow. They did not rush into naming whatever kindness was growing between them. Both of them had learned that wounded things heal better without being crowded. Still, the cabin noticed. It held her laughter differently. It made room for a second coffee mug by the sink. It let the lamplight fall warmer when she stayed until the stars came out. One evening in late July, Sheriff Nolan drove up with a folder under his arm and dust on his boots. The legal findings were complete. Earl Whitcomb would not return to the ridge. The Harper property records had been corrected, and a portion of the restored land had been granted as a memorial preserve through the county. Nolan handed Caleb a copy of the final survey, then looked toward the meadow where Hope was chasing grasshoppers beneath Atlas's watchful eye. Some folks in town want a marker placed near the trailhead, he said. Nothing big, just the family name. Maybe the dog's too. Caleb looked at Grace. She nodded once, her eyes soft. Mercy should be there, she said. So the following Saturday, Pine Hollow gathered at the edge of the new woodland trail. There were no speeches polished enough to feel false. Just neighbors standing beneath the pines, children holding wildflowers, Grace with Hope on a blue leash, Caleb with Atlas beside him, and Sheriff Nolan setting a simple cedar sign into the earth. Harper Family Trail. Beneath it, in smaller letters, for Mercy, who kept the promise. The wind moved through the branches, carrying the scent of resin and warm grass. Hope sat without being asked, unusually still. Atlas lowered his head. Caleb felt the old ache rise in him, not as pain this time, but as reverence. He thought of Mercy under the cabin, of a child's yellow block, of a scrap of blue cloth, of all the years when no one heard and still loyalty did not quit. Grace slipped her hand into his, brief and quiet, as natural as breathing. Caleb did not pull away. That night, back at the cabin, the sky opened into a field of stars, so bright it seemed the darkness had been forgiven. Hope fell asleep on the porch with his new collar glinting faintly. Atlas lay near the steps, eyes half closed, facing the woods. Caleb stood at the rail beside Grace and listened to the deep summer silence. It was not empty. It was alive with crickets, leaves, dog breath, and the steady peace of a home no longer hiding sorrow beneath its floor. Somewhere beyond the meadow, the new trail waited for morning footsteps. Somewhere beneath the porch, Mercy's collar rested in clean cloth, not buried in secrecy, but kept in honor. Caleb looked at the cabin, at the dogs, at the woman beside him, and understood at last that rescue did not always arrive with sirens or shouted commands. Sometimes it came as a scratch in the dark, a dog who refused to ignore it, and enough faith to lift one board at a time until the truth could breathe. Autumn returned to North Ridge with a slow gold light, brushing the meadow in copper and laying a clean chill across the porch each morning. The cabin stood firm now, its repaired boards weathered but honest, its windows bright at dusk, its hearth swept clean. Caleb still kept the old flashlight beside his bed, but he no longer woke with his hand around it. Some habits stayed because they had once kept him alive. Others softened when peace proved it could be trusted. Hope was nearly grown by then, all long legs, bright eyes, and stubborn joy. He had become a handsome German shepherd with a blue collar, a strong chest, and one ear that still leaned slightly when Grace spoke to him. Atlas had more gray along his muzzle, but his gaze remained steady, deep, and watchful, the kind of gaze that made people lower their voices without knowing why. Every morning, the two dogs walked the property line together. Atlas led. Hope followed, sometimes distracted by squirrels, sometimes pretending not to be, always returning to the old dog's side, as if loyalty itself could be learned by walking close enough to it. On the first anniversary of the night, they found Hope. Caleb rose before sunrise and made coffee while the cabin rested in darkness. Grace had stayed in the guest room after a late clinic emergency in town, and now she came quietly into the kitchen wearing a wool sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face still soft with sleep. She did not ask why he was awake. She only poured a second cup and stood beside him at the window. Outside, the porch boards glistened with frost. Atlas sat at the top step, facing the meadow. Hope lay beside him, his head resting against Atlas's shoulder. The sky behind the pines began to pale. 2:17, Grace asked gently. Caleb looked at the clock above the stove. The hands pointed to the minute that once carried dread through the floor. The cabin was silent. Not empty. Silent the way a church is silent before the first hymn. Caleb nodded. It used to feel like a warning. Grace wrapped both hands around her mug. What does it feel like now? He thought about that for a while. He thought of Mercy's collar under the porch, the Harper sign at the trailhead, Sheriff Nolan stopping by sometimes with quiet updates, children from town walking the trail with their parents, and Hope bounding ahead as if the land had been waiting all those years for laughter to return. He thought of the man he had been when he bought the cabin, trying to disappear inside old wood and distance. He thought of Atlas standing over the floor, refusing to let silence win. A reminder, he said at last. Grace looked at him. He did not explain further. He did not need to. Later that morning, Caleb carried a small cedar box to the Harper family trail. Inside was a new tag Grace had ordered from a maker in town. It was simple, silver, and engraved with one word. Mercy. They did not move the old collar. That belonged beneath the porch, close to the cabin she had guarded beyond all reason. This new tag was for the trail, for the living to see, for strangers to pause over without knowing the full weight of the name. Sheriff Nolan met them there with a post driver and 2 cups of diner coffee. A few neighbors came too, not as a crowd, just as witnesses. Hope sat beside the cedar sign, restless but trying. Atlas stood in front of it, calm as stone. Caleb fixed the tag beneath the words already carved there. When the first light struck it, the silver flashed once through the trees. No one clapped. No one needed to. Grace slipped her hand into Caleb's, and he held it this time like a promise he was no longer afraid to make. Hope leaned against his leg. Atlas lifted his nose toward the wind. Somewhere in the pines, a branch creaked softly, and for one breath, Caleb almost heard the old scratching again. But it was not beneath the floor anymore. It was in the trees, in the trail, in the lives that kept moving forward because one loyal heart had refused to be forgotten. That evening, the cabin glowed warm against the darkening ridge. Grace set 2 bowls of stew on the table. Hope slept by the stove, paws twitching through puppy dreams he had never outgrown. Atlas rested near the door, exactly where he could see the hearth, the porch, and the road. Caleb stood for a moment in the center of the room, over the boards that had once hidden a plea, and listened to the peaceful sounds around him. A spoon against ceramic. Firewood settling. Dog breath. Wind outside. Home. He placed his palm on the old floor and whispered, "We heard you." Then he rose, turned off the porch light, and let the cabin settle into a quiet that no longer begged to be answered. Some miracles do not arrive loud enough for the world to notice. Some come as a faint sound in the dark, a faithful dog who will not walk away, and a wounded man willing to kneel down and listen. And when grace finally finds a way in, It does not only save what was hidden beneath the floor. It saves everyone standing above it.